Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. We're going to do a little bit more exploring with embossing folders, so get comfy and let's get crafty. I have selected from my stash, it is the Memory Box 3D Sunflower Embossing Folder. These 3D embossing folders give you a little bit more substantial of an deboss and emboss. I'm also going to do this two ways. I'm going to emboss a piece of watercolor paper and a piece of 80-pound cardstock, and then I'm going to color the image. I'm going to use watercolors and Copic markers. Before I send my paper through, I'm going to give them a slight spray with my water bottle. It just kind of helps them emboss without breaking. Sometimes very detailed embossing folders can cause the paper to break if it's not just a tad wet. It's not soaked, it's just very lightly misted. So I'm going to run both the watercolor paper and this piece of Neenah Classic Press Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And you can kind of see the embossing detail there. Anyway, I've got a piece of Neenah and a piece of watercolor paper. I'm curious about two things as I start this project. Will the watercolor paper still absorb the water and spread the pigment? Or is sending it through the embossing folder going to make it too compact for the fibers to do that? So I've pulled out my Gonzi Tombi watercolors. I think I said those names in the right order because these are really bright, vibrant colors, and I haven't used this palette a lot lately. I've been exploring some of my other palettes. So I'm going to take a little squeeze dropper thing. What are those things called? An eyedropper? I don't know what it's called. That thing in my hand. I'm going to put a couple drops of water in a few different colors of green, some yellow, some oranges, and then a brown or a couple of shades of brown for the center. And we're just going to hop into it. Now I have sped this up like 8 times normal because it did take me a while to get the watercoloring done. As I suspected, sending the watercolor paper through the embossing folder in my die cut machine did kind of compress the fibers, and the water and the pigment did not spread in a traditional watercolor paper fashion. The pigment did spread with water, but the first couple of petals I put clear water on first and then added the pigment, and the pigment did not flow. I had to go in with a less wet brush and kind of put that pigment around. So then I started just putting in the layers, the dark yellows and then a lighter yellow. I am skipping petals as I'm doing each layer, because in my brain, when you're watercoloring, you don't do wet next to wet, right? You have to let it dry for a minute. I don't think that in this case, it would have been too big of a deal, just because the water wasn't really free-flowing like traditional watercoloring. So I'm just going to use 2 colors of kind of a dark yellow and a light yellow, and then kind of one color green. I tried to add another color of green for the stem. The stem is also raised, and so getting it very daintily painted, it took a minute. I had to get a much smaller brush and go about it that way. It's not the cleanest. The leaves, I think, did the best as far as the water spreading and adding pigment. I decided to go back and add a little bit of that dark orange back into the tips of the petals just to see if I could get a little bit more dimension. Looking at the cards in real life, you can definitely see that sunflower is popped up off the front of the card, but there is some of the embossed detail lost in the watercolor painting. And I don't know if that's because I'm adding water to the detail after the fact, or if it is because that detail was just lost in the embossing process. I'm not sure. However, I would 100% do this again. I think that the cards themselves turned out really nice. They're not the most clean coloring for sure. It was a little bit tricky, but the cards did look nice. We're going to jump into the Copic version of this card. Again, this is a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White, an 80 pound. And I'm just adding my Copics to the stem, my green selection here to the stem and the leaves. This was a cleaner, like the stem was much easier to keep in a nice clean, nice, cleanly colored. There we go. That's a phrase I'll use. However, I also noticed that after sending this Neenah paper, and Neenah is the paper I use for my Copic coloring all the time. I bought a huge ream of paper, I don't even know how long ago, and I need to buy a new one, but it's the one I use all the time for Copic coloring. And my Copics also did not really blend quite as easily. So I found that interesting that by compressing the fibers in the paper, sending it through the embossing folder or through the embossing machine inside the embossing folder, it did change how the alcohol inks would work in the paper as well. So I am taking, this is like a YR27, I think is the color on here. This one, I'm adding my darker shades into the veining of each petal. Now, I will say that on the Neenah, the details were not as lost, and that's why I think it's probably the adding of the water with the watercolors that kind of lost some of that embossed detail. So I'm going back through. This is a YR24, I think. I did not write the color combination down. I'm sorry, but I know they're YRs and the darkest one's a 27. So, you know, sunflower colors. So I am going through, this is a YR23 or a 21, the one that's kind of almost translucent and shiny. And this is where I'm really getting the shape of each petal. Sorry, had to pause and chat with my children for a minute. But anyway, this is where each petal starts to come into shape as I'm adding that lightest color, the part that goes out to the edge. And it's kind of starting to look like a sunflower. So embossing folders have been in my craft stash for a hot minute. And when I first started card making, I used them all the time, like all the time. I added some highlights there with a YR20. So I'm going into the center of the flower with E39, 37, I think, and then 35, just kind of adding some dimension there. It's kind of hard to do that center because it is raised, but, you know, it got done. So here are my two panels. We're going to go ahead and cut them into cards now. Just an FYI, the Copic coloring was at 3 times normal speed. So the raw footage of this video was about 45 minutes. So not terrible for 2 cards, especially with an experimental process, right? So I have 2 pieces of yellow cardstock I'm going to use for my card base. These are 4 1/4 inches wide by 5 1/2 inches tall. That is a US A2 size card. Mine are top folding tent style. That's just kind of my preference. I am going to trim these panels down because I want to have that yellow border. So I'm pulling in my little guillotine trimmer. And I cannot take much off the top, so most of the dimension is going to come off of the bottom. And the panels will end up being 4 inches wide by 5 1/4 inches tall. And that gives me just a small narrow frame around each of the sunflower panels. It kind of pulls out that yellow in the sunflower thing. In fact, on the Copic card, I could not even take any off the top, or the Copic colored version of the card. I'm using liquid glue. Anytime you have an embossed image, liquid glue is better because there's lots of highs and lows that you need the adhesive to stick to. And in my experience, using a double-sided adhesive on an embossed paper is not very successful. So this is the My Favorite Things glue tube. It's new in my stash. I'm trying it out. I don't hate it. I do think it comes out a little bit faster than my Tombow glue, but it sticks really well. I've also recently added the Barely Arts glue, so I'll be trying that out in the next couple of videos to see how I like that. I like that it has a small hole in the nib. So, and because I can, I'm going to add some Honeybee Stamps bling to these cards because it's on my desk and I'll use it for everything until they're all gone and then I'll buy more. So this particular color palette is, I can't remember, I think it is the Harvest Pearl because it had those kind of shimmery yellows and like a lightish yellowish green. So I've got 3 up by the flower and 2 down by the leaves. And on the Copic card, I'm just going to switch the side of the card that they are on. I am using multiple sizes. These pearls come in 2 or 3 sizes of each color. And I love them. They're super cool. For a sentiment, I'm using them. My favorite things, well, hello die. I'm going to cut the hello out of black cardstock, 1 for each paper. I did not layer it up. I felt like the embossing folder needed to be the star of the show because it was already that 3-dimensional embossed. So this time I'm using my Tombow because it does have a much smaller, nib is not the right word. The hole that the glue comes out of is smaller. I don't know what that's called. Yeah, so I'm not worrying about trying to get this hello word on at any kind of straight. It's very bubbly, very scripty writing. I don't think it has to be laid down flat. And quite frankly, at this point, I was running out of time before I had to go pick up my middle school kids from school. So it was just going together. I was not going to worry too much about perfection at this point. The nice thing about a card that took an hour-ish to create was that I got to chat with my mama on the phone while I was doing it. So that was awesome. A couple of close-ups of the sunflowers themselves, and then a couple close-ups of the finished cards. This is a really cool way to kind of accentuate the embossed images you can get with embossing folders. So cool deal. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I have a couple of other videos here that I think you will like. I also have that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me whether or not you have any embossing folders and how often you use them. Leave me a thumbs up and have a really fabulous day.